After America is made on the lands of the Kure-Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, we acknowledge that they and their ancestors have cared for the lands, rivers and sea, and all living creatures for thousands of generations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi, I'm Angus Blackman, and this is After America. It's never about regime change. Until it is. Over the weekend, the Trump administration threw the United States into Israel's war against Iran.
President Trump is about to address the nation. Roughly 2 hours ago, he announced via social media that the United States has bombed 3 nuclear sites in Iran.
The strikes were a spectacular military success. Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated. Iran, the bully of the Middle East, must now make peace. If they do not, future attacks will be far greater and a lot easier.
No, we're not at war with Iran, John. We're at war with Iran's nuclear program, and I think the president took decisive action to destroy that program last night.
They claim to have obliterated Iran's uranium enrichment facilities. That was supposed to be the whole point. But within hours, Trump upended all of that. The president posted that while it might not be politically correct to say it, regime change was, in fact, on the cards. It's now woke, apparently, to suggest that the United States, once again pursuing regime change in the Middle East, in contravention of international law and with no real plan, might not be a good idea. Joining me to discuss all of this, what it means for the United States, for the world, and for Australia, is Dr. Emma Shortis, Director of International and Security Affairs here at the Australia Institute. Hello, Emma.
Hey, Angus.
So this is obviously a really fast-moving story. We're recording at about 11:30 a.m. Australian Eastern Time on Monday, the 23rd of June. Could you just take us through what's happened up to this point for anyone who hasn't been following in detail?
Yeah, sure, for those lucky people who aren't obsessively following the news. So about 24 hours ago at the time of recording, so Sunday morning, Australian time at about 11 o'clock, we got news via a Donald Trump post on Truth Social that the United States had been drawn into Israel's war on Iran and had sent a full payload, as Donald Trump described it, and dropped it on a couple of uranium enrichment sites in Iran, so on nuclear facilities, and then returned to the United States. So instead of that 2 weeks that Donald Trump promised, that he was going to think about what the United States was going to do, he went ahead and did it and drew the United States into a conflict with Iran. In the meantime, figures from the administration, including the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, have come out and said that the United States, quote unquote, obliterated those sites in Iran.
For the entirety of his time in office, President Trump has consistently stated for over 10 years that Iran must not get a nuclear weapon. Full stop. Thanks to President Trump's bold and visionary leadership and his commitment to peace through strength, Iran's nuclear ambitions have been obliterated.
I think we should be skeptical about that. We don't yet know what the results of the bombings were and probably won't for a while, given the state of information coming out of the Trump administration. And on that as well, in the meantime, Trump has continued posting and has gone ahead and said the words regime change, even though, as he put it, it's not politically correct to say that. But it is now, or it has been for a while, openly on the table as an option. So what that means is the Trump administration has effectively put the world in a position where we are reliant on restraint from Iran, and cornering a regime like that, I think it should go without saying, but cornering a regime like that is incredibly dangerous and in no way contributes to peace building.
So I want to get to that possible response in just a second, but I wanted to take it back to, I guess, first principles. Like, is any of this legal?
I mean, it is kind of wild to say that as much as that should be the question, it is being treated really as irrelevant by, many of the people who should be viewing it as central. I think there are a number of aspects to that question of legality. So maybe we could start with the domestic one in terms of the domestic United States, because of course, it's the Trump administration that's doing this and drawing the United States into the conflict. It's technically not legal at all for the administration to do this. The reforms that happened after the Vietnam War require that the president go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war. And if the president doesn't get that, then the United States withdraws within 60 days. It's becoming, I think, pretty clear that the president has no interest or intention in going to Congress. And sitting alongside that, of course, is also that Supreme Court ruling from last year, an eternity ago, which effectively said that if the president is acting in an official capacity, then he has immunity. He can act like a king. So, as much as this is, I think, a fairly straightforward case in terms of legality, it doesn't really matter. Trump is unconstrained and has no regard for the rule of law domestically or internationally, and that's how he's going to proceed.
I cannot tell you everything that we know, but what I can share with you, when combined with what all of us have learned over the years, is deeply troubling. Saddam Hussein and his regime have made no effort to disarm as required by the international community. Indeed, the facts and Iraq's behavior show that Saddam Hussein and his regime are concealing their efforts to produce more weapons of mass destruction.
And so you said there are a few kind of considerations in terms of legality. We've talked about the domestic US law. How about international law? Because I remember during the War on Terror, there was a big effort to try and justify it legally, right? They sent Colin Powell to the UN and it was a whole thing. But that's not happening this time.
No, it is not happening this time. And I think you're right to draw out those parallels with 2003, Angus, because it does feel quite familiar, but in many ways it's very different, precisely because there has been no effort by the Trump administration to even pretend to adhere to the principles of international law or to assemble a coalition of the willing as the Bush administration did. There's been no real PR campaign to bring Americans, let alone the rest of the world, along with this. So there's no care for international law, and there's also no indication that any of this adheres to the principles of international law. And that's true especially of the Israeli government's initial attacks on Iran, which have been justified as preemptive or preventive. But under the principles of international law, the attack has to be imminent, and there's just no evidence that attack was imminent. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, has been going to the US Congress and saying that Iran will have the ability to develop nuclear weapons within a month since the 1990s. Like, this has been deployed as a pretense for attack for decades now, and there's no evidence that anything has changed. And in fact, reporting out of the United States suggests that there's no intelligence to support this claim of an imminent attack. It's just vibes.
Yeah. So, as you say, the pretense is Iran's nuclear program, and it does have an enrichment program. But I think you would argue, right, that it's not really about.
No, it's not. As I was saying earlier, Benjamin Netanyahu has been wanting to go after Iran in this way for a long time and has been wanting to draw the United States in to that conflict for a long time. The difference is that, in the past he encountered presidents who weren't willing to do that for very good reason. So the Israeli government will justify this attack on the basis of security, that Iran poses an unacceptable threat to Israel and therefore this program has to be eliminated. And this is not to minimize the risk that nuclear program in Iran does pose, when you're dealing with an authoritarian, aggressively authoritarian regime like the one in Iran. But steps had been taken to minimize that risk, through that agreement signed by the Obama administration, which had the support of the world, that Trump unilaterally withdrew the United States from. We're dealing with the immediate consequences of that. And I think, it's clear even from that withdrawal by the Trump administration that this wasn't about the nuclear program. It wasn't ever about dismantling that program. It was about going after Iran more broadly. And Trump, again, highlighted that when he used the words regime change on Truth Social just today. And I think that context, particularly in terms of US involvement, is really important. And this goes back a long way, without going into the detail of it. The United States in the 1950s through the CIA successfully engineered a coup in Iran in 1953. And the CIA was really proud of that, that it had installed a friendly regime in Iran in the 1950s. It was held up as one of the great successes of the CIA at that time. And they sought to repeat that process in a number of different places over the next few decades. Then the Iranian Revolution in 1979 in the United States was understood really as the loss, the quote unquote loss of Iran for the United States. And since then, there have been people walking around Washington, in presidential administrations who have wanted to pursue regime change in Iran, have wanted to undo that loss and bring Iran back into the United States sphere of influence.
And famously, during the War on Terror, George W. Bush included Iran as part of his axis of evil, right, with Iraq and North Korea.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And pretty explicitly during that period, during the War on Terror, some people in the Bush administration, including figures like Wolfowitz, saw Iraq and Afghanistan as stepping stones to pursuing regime change in Iran. And those people are still around. So that motivation on the part of the Israeli government and the Trump administration, I think, is very much in play here. The nuclear issue is a useful, I think, pretense. And again, Trump, as he does, has exposed that pretty clearly.
So I want to come back to Iran now. Obviously, it's impossible to say exactly how they might respond, how they can respond now after a bombing campaign by Israel and now the US. Do we have any sense, though, of what could happen from here?
I mean, I think the first thing I would say is that there is no real certainty about what happens now. Part of what happens in these kinds of crises is pundits will, declare with certainty what is going to happen or what everybody should do. And we should really treat that with a healthy dose of skepticism, not least because the kinds of people, especially in the American media, the kinds of people who championed the war on terror and the war on Iraq are the same kinds of people who are now talking about, what everyone should do in this situation, which is, I guess, a long way of saying that the lessons of history have not been learnt. In terms of what might happen next, though, I would say that the weight of history suggests that momentum is always towards further intervention when it comes to what the United States might do. That's not to say it's inevitable, but that's always where momentum heads, towards escalation of military intervention. And certainly the kind of like rah-rah rhetoric coming out of the United States, I think, supports that argument. In terms of the response from Iran, again, that is unpredictable and likely will have changed, by the time we finish recording. But news emerged this morning that the parliament there had voted to close the Straits of Hormuz, which is a pretty critical shipping lane for oil and other trade. That won't necessarily happen because the decision is not up to the parliament. Iran is not a democracy. That's not how it works. But certainly that's one of the options on the table in terms of retaliation, and that is probably already having significant impacts on things like oil prices and the global economy, which of course is already pretty unstable because of Trump's trade wars. So I think the prospects for that instability to increase at least are pretty significant. But I guess the other thing I would say is that nothing is inevitable. We're in a situation now where the decisions of individuals in the White House, in Iran, in Israel and elsewhere will have an enormous impact on what happens next. And again, that is very unpredictable. But I guess I would just emphasize again that cornering an autocratic regime like this, which is already isolated, makes for a very dangerous situation.
Yeah. And even theoretically, if the administration got its apparent wish and got regime change, we've seen from very recent history that that can be an unmitigated disaster as well. After overthrowing Saddam Hussein, very few people were sad to see the back of Saddam Hussein, obviously, but Iraq falls apart, we get ISIS.
Mm-hmm.
It's a mess, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that's why this idea of regime change is so frightening, because what does happen next, if there's a power vacuum in Iran, where, of course there is huge opposition to an awfully repressive regime, but there is not a concerted, organized opposition ready to take its place because of that oppression. And what does that mean for what comes next? What does that mean for the people of Iran who will suffer disproportionately because of this? What would such a power vacuum or instability mean in terms of the broader Middle East is an enormous question. And, this is where we come back to the lessons of history that you were just suggesting. What is the game plan here? What are the markers of success? What is the end game? The United States clearly doesn't have one. The Trump administration clearly does not have one. The Israeli government under Netanyahu does seem to have an end game, which is the effective destruction of Iran and its ability to target Israel. But again, it's worth repeating that the Israeli government is framing this war as being about the security of Israel, about ensuring the future existence of Israel. But attacking regimes like this, attacking organizations like this and, quote unquote, decapitating them might reduce their ability to attack Israel for a while. But what it also does is continue to radicalize generations of people in those places that are under attack who are responding to their lived reality. So, none of this builds long-term security. It builds in long-term insecurity and violence in a way that becomes more and more difficult to undo.
And as you kind of alluded to there, even if regime change happens in a power struggle after the fact, there is no guarantee that the new regime, whatever it is more friendly to US or Israeli interests long term, right?
Absolutely.
And it's hard to bomb expertise, if you're talking about a nuclear program, right? Like you might destroy the facilities, that could degrade them for a period of time. But as you say, who knows?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I mean, Israel has for a long time used targeted assassinations to attack that kind of expertise. But again, that expertise can be built up. And I'm not sure if I buy into this argument, but a lot of, what we might describe as international relations realists are making the argument that the lesson that autocratic regimes draw out of this is that actually you need a nuclear weapon, that you can't rely on the United States. You can't trust the United States when it comes to disarmament or non-proliferation. And so the obvious answer is to go to nuclear weapons. I'm not sure I buy into that argument, but certainly the quote unquote hardheads would take that lesson out of all this. And so it does become an unmitigated disaster. And, just to go back to your initial point about regime change, the United States spent just unbelievable amounts of blood and treasure in Afghanistan to replace the Taliban with the Taliban. What makes us think this situation would be any different? To hear J.D. Vance, Vice President.
I certainly empathize with Americans who are exhausted after 25 years of foreign entanglements in the Middle East. I understand the concern, but the difference is that back then we had dumb presidents, and now we have a president who actually knows how to accomplish America's national security objectives.
Imagine that being your argument. It's extraordinary.
Yeah. So I want to come back to Trump and the US. You've always argued that Trump is not anti-war, but that was kind of part of his appeal, and he certainly used that heavily in his campaign. Does this kill that kind of argument once and for all?
Well, I mean, they're trying to suggest that it doesn't, to go back to J.D. Vance, he was asked on American TV if the United States is at war with Iran, and he said, no, we're not at war with Iran. We're at war with Iran's nuclear program. Come on. And they are all kind of making the argument that, there aren't troops on the ground. It's not the same as the forever wars. This is a demonstration of American strength. We've obliterated those nuclear facilities and now we're out. But, I think it does highlight the the kind of bald-faced lies, really, about Trump being anti-war. He's not anti-war at all. He loves displays of military strength. He loves dropping bombs, particularly in the Middle East, which he did during his first administration as well. So I think the administration sees an easy argument here, that they can convince the base that, it's different because Trump is doing it, and it's limited. It's a question of, how does Trump put it? I alone can fix it, that he's not a dumb president and so it's okay. Whether the base buys into that is another question. YouGov did some polling just in the last couple of days that found that 60% of respondents were against the United States being drawn into a war with Iran. Trump may be able to turn it around with his base. He turns everything else around with his base, so we've got no reason to expect he can't do it again. I think part of the risk here is not so much that the base turns against Trump on this, but that it increases political apathy in the United States, where Trump was the only one really promising to end the forever wars and not draw the United States into further conflicts, where, his opponent in Kamala Harris was promising the most lethal military in the world and deploying Dick and Liz Cheney as her support. If even Trump can't undo that, I think, many people who voted for him or vaguely supported him because they thought he might shake up that consensus, of course I'm speculating here, but, I think are likely to disengage further from an already very fragile and unstable democratic system in America.
Yeah, like where are they going to go? What are their options?
Yeah, there aren't any.
Yeah.
The IC continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and Supreme Leader Khamenei has not authorized the nuclear weapons program that he suspended in 2003.
You have that Iran is building a nuclear weapon. Your intelligence community has said they have no evidence that they are at this point.
Well, then my intelligence community is wrong. Who in the intelligence community said that?
Your Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard.
She's wrong.
It has been interesting seeing some of those fractures within the MAGA movement play out. In recent days, Trump directly contradicted his Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, saying she was wrong about Iran. She seems to have changed her story to say, okay, maybe they are developing a nuclear weapon, when previously said she had no intelligence suggesting that. It does seem to kind of portray a kingly-like government that you don't want to contradict the commander-in-chief, in these situations, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Gabbard was really strongly anti-war with Iran, had posted quite a bit to that end, and has fairly predictably, totally flipped, and now is coming out in support of Trump, even though, we know there's not the intelligence. It was just vibes and Trump making the decision. But this is what he does so effectively, isn't it? He controls the narrative. They all flip to support him. We've seen Gabbard do that, and even seen, there's been some pretty extraordinary positioning on social media of all the people in the administration, high-level people, the defense secretary, the vice president, saying, we're not pursuing regime change, that's not the aim. And then, like half an hour later, Trump posting to say, oh, no, regime change is the thing that we're doing. And then, of course, they all fall in line. Like, this happens consistently and is a mark of the control, the kingly control, I think, exactly as you described, that Trump has over the party and the administration. And I think also it's worth saying again, that it was never really an anti-war administration. There were individual figures like Gabbard, but they were always going to be subsumed into Trump's way of looking at the world, which is inherently violent.
Yeah. I want to quickly cover some of the responses. So let's start with the Democrats. What, if anything, are they doing?
Predictably, I think the responses from Democratic leadership have been, I guess, equivocating at best, and that the blob that I was talking about, where there are people who are pretty committed to regime change or a continuation of American kind of military adventurism, that includes the Democrats as well. There are people within the Democratic Party who are pretty happy with pursuing Iran, are pretty happy with unconditional support for the Israeli government. And we've seen that in some of the pretty lackluster responses to what Trump is doing. Outside of that leadership, there have been some really strong statements coming from people like Senator Bernie Sanders, from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who has gone so far as to call for Trump's impeachment as a result of these actions in Iran. There's some really quite striking videos of Bernie Sanders at a rally getting the news in real time about the Trump administration's strikes and the really strong response from his audience.
I agree. And I want to tell you something. Not only is this news that I've just heard this second alarming, that all of you have just heard, but it is so grossly unconstitutional. All of you know that the only entity that can take this country to war is the U.S. Congress. The president does not have the right.
You know, as we have come to expect from the Democratic Party, the leadership is very out of step with the base when it comes to opposition to Trump and ideas about how to oppose Donald Trump. The Democrats are not pulling themselves together on this issue, and I don't expect that they will anytime soon.
I mean, just on that AOC statement that it might be an impeachable kind of offence, he's already been impeached twice in his first presidency. The Republicans control the House and the Senate. Obviously, that could change, but whether or not that would lead to a different outcome in the vote, who knows?
I mean, it seems unlikely for that exact reason.
There are quite clearly going to be no consequences for this, right?
It certainly seems that way. And there has been a bit of really interesting analysis around that. You know, what is the point of Congress at the moment? Why does it even exist if it's not there to oppose illegal actions by the president or to oppose the president unilaterally taking the United States to war? And again, you know, this I think has to be seen in that broader context that you were outlining about, you know, Trump's willingness and ability to sideline Congress to pretty much dissolve any effective checks and balances on his power. And again, you know, that's where we kind of encounter those long threads of American history again, where presidents have accumulated pretty extraordinary powers when it comes to foreign policy in particular, you know, and an ability to take the United States to war without democratic accountability. Trump is able to do that because of the space created by previous presidents and previous Congresses that were not willing to hold a president to account on these issues.
What's the global response been like? We've seen the Trump administration have big fights with its own allies, in Europe in particular. What's their response been to this?
The European response has been actually pretty lackluster, I think. I have been a little bit taken aback at how, I guess, wishy-washy the statements are. And I think that is happening for a number of reasons. You know, part of it is not wanting to attract the ire of the Trump administration again, you know, on the part of many European allies. It's also the outsized role that support for Israel plays in many of those nations, Germany especially. And so it's been pretty extraordinary to see, you know, pretty much all of the statements coming out of those nations foregrounding the need for Iran to return to the negotiating table rather than the other way around, rather than for the United States, which is the, you know, country that ripped up the original agreement, rather than calling for the United States to return to negotiations or to adhere to the principles of international law, for example. So it's not exactly heartening, I think, when, you know, many of us had hoped for some stronger opposition to the Trump administration's assault on international law, particularly from, you know, European allies of the United States. It's not exactly heartening to see the statements that are coming out of those places at the moment.
Yeah, and not great support for the argument that there's some global progressive alliance being formed.
Yeah. The revitalization of the global left is taking a little bit longer than many people had hoped, I think.
On that, Australia, the government and the coalition have backed the US strikes, though the coalition more vociferously.
The world has long agreed that Iran cannot be allowed to get a nuclear weapon, and we support action to prevent that. That is what this is.
The coalition supports military action taken by the United States to stop Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons.
You're a government that talks about transparency and talks about being upfront with the Australian people. So was a facility like Pine Gap used in this attack? Was information that's been garnered there used as part of this attack on Iran?
We are upfront, but we don't talk about intelligence, obviously. But we've made very clear this was unilateral action taken by the United States.
Australia obviously has a history of following the US into wars. Is there a risk that that happens again?
I think that's a huge risk. I think you're right to identify the history of Australia following the United States effectively into any war it has fought since the Second World War, no matter where and no matter why. That context is still very much alive and points to continued Australian support for American militarism. You know, I think the statements coming from the government supporting US strikes against Iran are pretty concerning and highlight again a pretty deep hypocrisy, not just in Australia, but across the West when it comes to the so-called international rule of law, you know, which is applied unevenly depending on who is doing the breaking of the international rule of law. And I thought it was really striking that the Australian foreign minister today, during one of the interviews she did, was asked about, you know, whether a request had come for Australian support for Australian troops or whatever, and the reply was that no request had come, and you know that they weren't going to speculate, which is the right one. But it reminded me that Australia has a history of committing support to American wars even before a request comes, sometimes even without a request. You know, Australia has a history of doing it preemptively to try and ensure that mythical US security guarantee. And it appears, at least initially, that even the Trump administration, even despite, you know, who Trump is and what he is doing and the way he is threatening global security and dismantling the international rule of law, has not changed that. And the risks for Australia there are significant, especially because, you know, we are already implicated in any almost any American conflict because of how deeply integrated we are in the American military industrial complex. You know, American planes can refuel at Tyndall. You know, we don't know what kind of role Pine Gap plays in intelligence gathering for these kinds of operations or for targeting. The government won't tell us explicitly, but we do know that we are already implicated. And what that effectively means is that even in the very unlikely situation, historically speaking, that Australia would not want to commit to, you know, joining American military adventurism again in the Middle East, saying no, not doing that is actually really quite difficult because we are so implicated already. And again, you know, the signs coming out of the government, despite that stonking majority it has, despite talk of the international rule of law and, you know, Australian values, it appears that those circumstances are still very much alive.
Well, Emma, on that extremely grim note, thanks very much for joining me.
Anytime. Thanks, Angus.
Apropos of nothing, we thought now might be a good time to remind you that the Australia Institute is calling on the Australian government to hold a parliamentary inquiry into the AUKUS submarine deal. You can add your name via the link in the show notes. If you'd like to hear more from Emma, and you're based in Melbourne, come along to an event she's doing to discuss her new essay, After America. Emma will be in discussion with Dr. Richard Dennis, Executive Director of the Australia Institute at the University of Melbourne on the 16th of July. You can register via the link also in the show notes. And finally, if you like the work we do at the Australia Institute, please consider supporting our end of financial year appeal. By donating today, you'll help fund the research that's changing Australia for the better. All donations over $2 are tax deductible, and you know where to find the link. This episode was recorded on Monday, the 23rd of June, and it probably goes without saying that a bunch of stuff will probably have changed since then. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation, and we'll be back next week. I'm Angus Blackman. Thanks for listening.